Steve, you've written another issue brief, and this time it talks about Social Security and people who have both covered employment from Social Security and uncovered pensions in jobs that were not covered by Social Security. It gets a little bit tricky about how to avoid double counting, you might say. And so Congress has come up with this bill called the Social Security Fairness Act, which essentially would eliminate attempts to achieve parity between these two groups. And you've described it as the Social Security Unfairness Act. Do you want to take a shot at explaining these?
Unpack that.
Yeah, so yeah, sadly, and this is part of the public policy problem of this issue, is it's confusing and complicated. And so as a result, people don't often know what to think about it. There's about 20 million state and local government employees, teachers, firefighters, policemen, you know, the Department of Motor Vehicles,
Bureaucrats,
all the people who work for state and local governments. So nationally, there's about 20 million, and somewhere between 5 and 6 million are excluded. So about over a quarter of state and local employees are exempt from Social Security. They don't pay in and they don't collect. And it varies by state. There are a dozen or so states where almost none of the employees are covered, and the other 30, 40 states, virtually everybody's covered. So it varies a lot. And so that's sort of the background, is that you have this large group of people who are exempt from Social Security. They don't pay in, they don't collect. However, Social Security is an interesting program. So if you have a married couple, and let's say one of spouse is a teacher and the other spouse is, works for the auto company, he's covered and the spouse is not. So what happens though is when you retire, the retired auto guy collects a pension, and his spouse is entitled to what's called a spousal benefit. And if he dies, the spouse is entitled to a survivor's benefit. And so Social Security pays these extra benefits to people in the case of married couples. Now, if both spouses are covered by Social Security, there are these rules that offset one benefit against the other. So essentially, if you're entitled to a retirement benefit and a spousal or survivor benefit, you don't really get both of them. You get essentially the larger of the two. You get your own plus the difference. And effectively, that's to say that if you're entitled to more than one benefit, pick the biggest one, and that's the one you get. That's sort of the rule. So there's this offset. And what happened was you had state and local employees who were married to somebody who was covered, or alternatively, let's say you have a teacher. And so in the year that they're teaching, they're not covered by Social Security, but in the summer, they take a part-time job working at the local bookstore or whatever. They're covered part-time in the summer when they're not teaching, and then in the school year, they're teaching and they're not covered. So you have these situations where people, either because of their spouse or because of some part-time job, either before or after or during their careers as a state and local government employee, they gain coverage of their own. Well, before the late 70s and the early 80s, when they decided to fix this, there was this inequity where essentially someone who qualified as a state and local government employee, they were not paying into Social Security, they were exempt from Social Security, but they had this other job or they had this spouse. It allowed them to collect benefits both from their own retirement system, non-covered retirement system, plus it allowed them to collect from Social Security. But because of the way the law was written, there was no offset. So essentially they could, I hate to use the term double dip, but essentially they were collecting both their pension that was supposed to be the proxy for Social Security, and they were collecting the Social Security benefits, and there was no offset. So they were being treated more favorably than a couple who lived across the street, and both spouses in that case were covered. So you had a situation where a married couple in which one was covered and one was not was getting more favorable treatment than another couple in which both spouses were covered. And so you had this disparity. So in 1977, they passed what's called the government pension offset. And then in 1983, they passed what was called the windfall elimination provision. And so these provisions have been in law now for 40 years or more. And obviously, nobody likes them because they're complicated and confusing. And people who get these pensions think, well, why can't I collect my Social Security because I paid in and participated, or my spouse paid in and they participated, and I should be able to get these benefits. So quite often they're unaware of the fact that these rules that we call the WEP and the GPO, there's another version of those that applies to everybody else. And it's called the dual entitlement rule. And then there's this issue of how the benefit formula works under Social Security, having to deal with the progressivity of the benefit formula. And so anyway, essentially, there's this feeling that somehow we're picking on, we being the Congress by passing these two laws, they're picking on the state and local employees who are exempt, and they're being treated unfairly. And so Congress introduced this bill called the Social Security Fairness Act. And what the Fairness Act does is it repeals these two provisions of law that were enacted in order to achieve some parity between covered and non-covered workers. And so from my perspective, you can argue that these two provisions are not well drafted. They don't exactly produce the intended result. There's some, sometimes they over reduce the benefit and sometimes they under reduce the benefit. It's hard to get it just right.
Yeah, there's a lot of arbitrariness in that offset. It's not really, they just sort of picked an amount when they put this formula together and threw it into legislation without any kind of analysis or forethought.
Exactly. Well, this was, again, it was the late 70s, early 80s. There weren't a lot of people running around with micro simulation computer models that could look at all the different ways of doing this and who it would affect and how it would affect them. And so, there was an imprecision to the way they did this. So legitimately, people don't like these provisions because they say they don't do the job correctly. And there's some validity to that argument. Right. In fact, I share that view. But the notion of simply repealing the provisions, aside from the fact that it would cost $180 billion, and it would also accelerate the exhaustion of the trust fund from around 2034 or 2035 to 2034. But there is a legitimate need to provide some sort of offset between these benefits because that's the way we treat people who are covered only by Social Security. So if you only have Social Security, these offsets apply. And the notion of simply repealing them, in my view, would be unfair because there is a legitimate sort of issue here. So really the bigger issue is not should we repeal these provisions, but should we fix or reform or change the provisions? And in fact, I'm working on another paper in which I look at the different ways in which you could go about reforming these provisions.